How are you going? Hold on. I'm going to
Good.
put a background on so you don't have to see the corner of my
No
palette.
problem. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. How is
Good.
it going?
Hi, Ellen. Welcome. I've just got everyone just telling us where they're tuning in from this morning.
How's that?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great. Okay, let's jump straight in. Give me 1 second.
I just saw Annie. What I actually saw was Annie mentioning Fred.
How fun. From Bronte, from Sydney, Melbourne, New York. Awesome. Oakland, California. This is great. Okay, let's jump straight in. So I'm just posting the Slido link, everyone. So that's we'll leave around 10 minutes at the end for Aubrey to answer your questions. So please post them in the Slido link over, shout out to Oakland. This is fun. Okay, so please post those questions into the Slido link. Thanks very much. So welcome to the first day of our Liminal conference. We're so excited to have you all here. I'm Danny, the head of community at Blackbird. So together with StartMate, we've produced Liminal to give you a snapshot into meaningful careers in startups. So hopefully you'll leave this week feeling super inspired to, possibly make a career change or just to understand the path into meaningful startup careers. Even when it doesn't feel so obvious at the moment. So Liminal has been created as a taste for the Startup Fellowship. So the fellowship is a 2-month program that helps you land your dream job in a startup. They're building your knowledge and networks. So through the StartMate Fellowship, we're working to make a tangible impact on gender parity in the startup ecosystem through an all-women program. And I'm happy to say that applications are now open for the StartMate Fellowship, and it will be launching in September. So quick housekeeping before I hand you over to Aubrey. So we are recording this session, so that it'll be available afterwards in case you miss anything. Again, please put those questions into Slido and we'll get to them at the end there, not into the Zoom Q&A, please. And please tweet and share your thoughts and spread the word on socials. We're really excited for this week and for this program. So on to our special guest, we have Aubrey Blanche here with us. Aubrey is the Director of Equitable Design and Impact at Culture Amp. She's a startup investor and advisor. And through her work, she seeks to question, reimagine and redesign the systems and practices that surround us to ensure that all people can access equitable opportunities and build a better world. So super excited to have Aubrey here. I'm going to hand it straight over. I'm not sure if you have slides, but you're welcome to share those if you do, just by sharing screen. And hand it over to you now, and I'll be back for our questions section. Thank you.
Right. Okay, here we go. Everybody got the slides. I'm so excited to be here, not only because I am the Director of Equitable Design at Culture Amp. Before that, I was the head of diversity at Atlassian for about a half a decade. So I think this might actually qualify me for an honorary PR. We'll see at this point. I'm doing my best to become Australian. But like I said, I'm really excited to be here with you all. And I wanted to talk to you about sort of the practice that I do, which is called equitable design. And this is something that I developed thinking about talent processes. And you can absolutely use this framework for talent processes like performance and recruiting. But I wanted to talk about what does it look like to use equitable design in the context of product development. So that's a little bit of the case study we'll go into. So really excited. First, let me tell you a little bit about who I am, because I think it'll make more sense. So I'm Aubrey, but they call me the Mathpath, which means that I'm a math nerd and an empath put together. And I really think that that's what I try to bring to the work. So how do we ground the work that we're doing in empirical rigor, be really thoughtful about how we measure the effectiveness of what we're doing, but always balance that with having an incredibly human approach, understanding that the choices we're making deeply and meaningfully impact many, if not billions of human lives. And so it's the reason that I'm so excited to talk to you, because people who are building products and companies these days can do terrible harm in the world if they're not conscious about the way that their products are impacting users, but also if they do it correctly, can actually fundamentally build a better world than the one that we've inherited. And so I hope that's what you take away from this, is that you all have incredible power to change the world by simply adjusting some of the choices that you're making. So first, I want to talk a little bit about inequity, and you'll find I'm going to talk a lot about racism in this talk, both because it is 2020 and for far too often the discussion is centered on women without considering sort of other intersections. But before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about this. So anyone on the line want to take a guess at what this is? It's the Roman aqueducts. So what we know about the Roman aqueducts is they are an incredible feat of human engineering, like a product or like a company. But there was something really shitty about them. So what the aqueducts were used for in ancient Rome was to carry water from outside the city to the city center that allowed Rome to support a much higher population density than it would have been otherwise. But what's often not remarked on in this is that the pipes that carried the water in the aqueducts were lined with lead. As we are probably aware, lead is not the optimal thing to build our water pipes out of as humans. And so I really encourage you to think about racism and sexism and ableism, et cetera, on down as the things that impact and infect your entire organization and your entire product development process unless you intentionally design against it. So in the same way that we're often having discussions about the idea of there's only racist and anti-racist, there is no non-racist. There is no such thing as neutral design. There is only design that promotes and re-entrenches inequity and discrimination, and design that designs against it. Those are the only sides of the aisle. And so what I'm hoping to do is move you maybe from neutral or lack of action, which by default upholds the status quo, to thinking about the things that you can do day to day to change what you're doing to make the world a little better. So first, I want to talk a little bit about outcomes. So we talk a lot about diversity. I don't actually think it's very useful to talk about diversity. And the reason is because diversity is an outcome of equitable processes. And so when we talk about diversity as the outcome, we often cut corners and don't actually solve underlying challenges. For example, we think that we can solve problems of inequity in technology by simply recruiting people from certain groups. And I'll talk about why that's a problematic approach. Inclusion is, right, diversity and inclusion is often what we talk about. Inclusion being the quality of being included or feeling appropriate in a space. The problem with inclusion is it's very assimilationist. It actually requires people to change themselves to fit in, which doesn't get you the business benefits you want or build the world that we want to build. So instead of inclusion, I prefer to focus on belonging. So belonging is a core human need. But what it also is, rather than inclusion, which says we built a space and it's fine if you show up, belonging says we built this space with you in mind. Which one of those spaces would you want to be in? And I want to talk about equity. I'm much more interested in equity than diversity. And the reason for that is I can put people of all different races in a room, but if I have not considered equity, people from those marginalized groups are still going to be treated like shit. And that's just not good enough. So understand that diversity is the outcome of equitable companies, equitable processes, equitable products, right? So diversity is actually an indicator to us of whether we have achieved equity. So using diversity as the outcome and equity as the process. So now I want to talk a little bit about, every school of design, you need some design principles to tell you how to do this. And so I want to talk about the principles of equitable design. So first, authentic consent. We actually think about the power dynamics of the asks that we make of people and the way that we interact with them. And we make sure that when consent is given, it's fully and freely given. So this can be in the context, say, of an organization, making sure that those underrepresented employees you're asking to do extra interviews so that you have balanced panels, authentically want to give that time. They feel that it is worth their time, not that they're being pressured to do it. Or this might show up in terms of research, right? And making sure that the user research we're doing with people, that they fully consent to the experience that they're having. The second principle is intersectionality. So we don't design for the center. We consider people who have multiple identities of oppression, exclusion, or marginalization, and we prioritize designing for them. This helps us design universally, right? So we don't think of people at the margin as the edge case that's not worth considering, but rather that is the stress case that is the most important case for us to understand if our product or our system is working well. Community driven. So it's really important when we think about designing equitably that we design with and we don't design for. I think we see this a lot right now as everyone is jumping in and buying every book on anti-racism. Here in America, what I see a lot of, for example, is white people deciding what Black people need and giving them that, as opposed to listening to the Black community and providing what the Black community has explicitly asked for. So in a particular case, the Black community has asked for regulation of policing, and largely what we've gotten so far is a 3-day weekend for Juneteenth and a change to the syrup bottles. Not quite the same thing. Iteration. So understand that this process of equitable design is not one that ends, that this is a constant set of questions that we ask as we move through our work. And so the idea is our outcomes become our inputs as we go through this cycle. So for anybody who's worked in an agile way, this will probably sound pretty familiar. So now I want to talk about a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. So what we tend to see in the idea of what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion is that lots of companies make statements of intention. And I'm here to tell you that statements of intention are horseshit. What I mean by that is I cannot tell you how many companies, how many executives I've talked to say, I care about diversity or I care about fairness. But when you find out that they've spent 10x as much on branding, beer, and t-shirts as they have on their D&I program, what I'm telling you is you do not care about diversity. You care about your feelings and lying to the people that you're harming. I know that was heavy, but accountability is important, and that's what we're moving towards. Is it's okay to state your intention along with the resources that you're allocating to realize that intention. And so then what we actually want to focus on is what's accountability for outcomes. So sometimes you state an intention, put resources towards it, and you don't hit the outcome. That's okay, but you need to be open about that. Say, this is how we failed, this is why, and here's what we're doing the next time. So again, I'm not impressed by statements, I'm impressed by outcomes. Next, we're moving from thinking about programs of work or features to moving to structural interventions. So in a lot of the work I do in culture, right, it's not thinking we need ERGs, we need a multicultural employees leadership program, but rather we ask the question, where in the system are people experiencing inequity and what solutions might be to that? So you might still end up with employee resource groups or with a leadership program, but you're thinking about that program differently. It's not about we have it so it's good. It's that this is a thing we're doing to solve a specific problem. We're moving away from corporate right feminism, where companies say, well, we're going to start with gender. Because if you look at what diversity means at the top of most Australian companies and American and Euro, the people who have benefited from starting with gender are straight, white, cisgender, economically privileged women who are probably only one network click away from the executives that are already there. And not to malign people who have been given opportunities, but understanding that what that does is further marginalize LGBTI women, further marginalize women of color, and especially marginalizes Black women. And so taking that design principle of intersectionality, we can actually change the game. And we can say, rather than doing that, we actually consider the research we have about Black and Indigenous women, and we optimize our designs for their experiences. Because what is an empirical fact is that when we design for those experiences, those straight white cisgender women also benefit, but it does not work in reverse. It does not work in reverse. The other reason it's important is because racism is one of the most difficult issues to tackle within these systems. And so when you start with racism, you build a set of skills that make it easier to address other issues of oppression like ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. We're also moving away from this word diverse, which is so blurry as to mean nothing, to thinking about the concepts of underrepresentation and balance. So I want to tell you, as a queer Latina woman, it is really offensive to be called diverse. Unless we are calling white men stereotypes, I'm not interested. And by the way, please don't do that. It's very rude. Really talking about underrepresented and when something is in a state of balance. The last thing is that we're moving away from thinking about whole companies or whole systems to thinking about teams. We're in the concept of products, features. Really thinking about how people own their sphere of influence. And again, that accountability is for what they can fairly change. And for each of us, that will be different based on our roles and our positionality. All right, now what does that look like in practice? So there's a new playbook. So the first part of equitable design is actually internal. Understand why you haven't thought about equity in your decisions before. Was it a lack of knowledge? What is the lack of intent? Was it there wasn't enough social pressure for it? Was it that you just didn't care? Whatever that reason is, you need to know it because that was your barrier and you need to overcome that to be successful. Next, question everything. The fact is, we talk about things like unconscious bias, and what I'm so grateful for in 2020 is us social justice professionals are finally allowed to tell you it was never unconscious bias, it was actually racism, but people were too fragile to let us say it. And so what I want to offer to you is that everything that you've done so far has been an output of your choices, and so is everything that you will do. So I understand that it can bring up guilt and shame, but imagine that everything about our world can be done differently. You have the power to do that, and I want you to embrace that because you can build literally a better world. So the operational question is, does this thing, whether it's a process or a feature, help us create equal power or equal opportunity? If that question animates how you build, you will more often get it right. This is where I come in and I'm going to show you how we do this with products. And what I'm asking you is make this real. This is a framework, this is a set of ideas, but this is something that you can bring into the world in something you do every day. So let's talk about product development. The steps aren't that complicated. Listen to the people most impacted, ideate with them, test what you think might be true, and then make sure that you continuously monitor the outcome of your actions, the outcome of your feature or product, to make sure that over time it doesn't drift into inequity. So product design, what would this look like? First, question yourself. Question the assumptions you have about the problem, the people it impacts, and what your constraints are. Then ask the people most impacted by your choices how it will impact them. So this can be helpful if you have a homogenous team. Understand that your team will build worse products because it has less knowledge of how the world works. If you can't get that diversity on your team, find a way to reward people who give you that insight. 3, imagine anything as a solution. And I go back to this because so often when we think about inequity, we get tied up in the way things always been or the way they have to be. Nothing has to be the way that it is. Everything is the set of our collective choices. Before you build, plan your measures of impact and how you will continuously monitor them. This is incredibly important because if you don't do that, you likely won't get to it and you won't know the inequity or equity that you've created in the world. Test everything constantly, right? We're living in a world where we generate reams of data and we can use data to create more equitable outcomes. And I can't stress it enough. We have to continuously monitor outcomes because we're talking often about features, about processes, about programs that operate in complex systems. And so those systems are constantly evolving. So what worked last year what created equity last year might create inequity this year. So if there's any kind of thing that I want to give you, it's that equitable design is usually about changing what you were doing by 1%. 1% change. An example of an equitable design of a professional interaction. I get a lot of emails asking to talk to young folks or folks' nieces or kids about career paths. And I recognize that the people who are able to email me and introduce their kids often have more privilege and power than those who don't. And so I say yes because I want to be helpful. But for every one of those phone calls I do with a student who has a parent who's an executive, I ask that student to identify an underrepresented classmate who doesn't have the network connections to get that advice, to make sure that I'm giving the advice in an equitable and balanced way. So that's my example for my real life. Again, I want you to see how this process of equitable design can change every aspect of the way you move in the world. 1% adjustments. That's what gives us the world we all deserve. So you already know how to do this. I've given you a couple frameworks. I've given you a little bit of language, but this requires the skills you already have pointed at the idea of justice, equity, and fairness. And the thing I have to tell you is that you're probably exhausted. If you're like a lot of the folks I'm coaching right now, they're saying, oh God, I'm overwhelmed with everything I'm learning and thinking about racism. And it's okay to rest. It's okay to take a break, but it's not okay to quit. This is a continuous process and something that we carry with us everywhere. So that is all of the content I have prepared for you, but I am so excited to take your questions.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in. So hopefully if we don't get to all of them, you wouldn't mind, potentially I can send someone to you.
Yeah, let's do it. Email me. And then also if I don't get it, I am a Twitter human. So feel free to tweet questions at me if you want. That's at AD Blanche.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So our first one here is, what is your advice for getting old school male run businesses to genuinely care about diversity and belonging?
If you're capable, quit and get a different job. Deprive them of the brilliance that you have. Like, I will be totally honest with you, as someone who has done this work, I think one of the things that I have never successfully done, which is get people to care about things they don't care about. And so I think one of the things is that would, and I'm very, I would say that I'm very optimistic about Australian tech in this way. I know there's some obvious examples right now of institutional corruption supporting abusers as it relates to diversity and inclusion. But I think that, yeah, the biggest thing, if you have the ability to do so, is not to focus on changing the minds of people who don't care, but changing the situation that you're in. So can you create an inclusive environment where you are, if you run a team, or just among your peers? So yeah, I think the answer is our energy is best spent teaching people who care how to act correctly than wasting our energy on people who are trying to exhaust us and distract us from the project of justice.
Awesome. Great answer. So we've got a few here that are quite similar, so I'll just condense them. What is, you've mentioned that 1%, the small adjustment that companies can implement today. What are some examples there? I think people are kind of looking for something tangible.
Yeah, so 1%, I think like something in recruiting, no longer looking at the previous companies that people have worked for to determine whether they're eligible for a role, because we know that hiring is so rife with many different types of discrimination that you're literally baking in discrimination to your hiring process by saying, oh, I'd rather hire someone who came from Google. No offense to anyone who worked at Google, but the fact is, if you're a person of color, it's harder to get a job at Google. If you're a woman, it's harder to get a job at Google. And I use Google as an example, like I literally would pick any company and it would be true because that's the way that sexism and racism, et cetera, work. So that's one thing. In your performance review process, we did this work at Atlassian. We broke out the components of our rating such that if you were, we called it the anti-brilliant jerk performance process. But basically what we said is that employees were rated differently on different parts of their contributions. And we automatically computed the weights so that a manager couldn't, for example, give more credit for technical competence than for the behaviors that someone exhibited with their team. So teeny tweaks to processes can produce very different outcomes.
So I have a question here. How do we ensure that we recognize against like corporate white feminism as an issue, as most places of work don't acknowledge this?
I think asking questions. So when someone says women, my favorite question is which women? And if someone says all women, ask again, which women? What do you mean by that? What data tells you that this is something that all women face? Because the answer might be that they have that data, in which case we should definitely go after that. But I always, and again, I'm a Latina, so this impacts me despite the fact that I am white passing, is I always ask, what about women of color? Why are we not prioritizing them when we know that they face greater barriers in the workplace? Why have we not thought about LGBTI women? How would they relate to that? And so I think questioning is really powerful, because it gives me it gives you the ability to push someone's thinking back. And what often happens in this work is that us as advocates, it's like, prove what you're doing is valuable. And I actually want to flip the script and say, no, prove to me that the status quo is optimized. Because it's not.
Great answer. So we have a few, again, sort of similar questions here, but one is, how can you personally show up to make sure that these conversations with leaders around equitable design are happening?
Yeah, so again, I go back to asking questions. Anyone who worked with me in the past will know that I am persistent, if nothing else. And that's what I would say is, be indefatigable about this. Don't allow the subject to change until an answer happens. So ask leaders publicly. Don't let them get away with answers like, well, I care. Ask specific questions. What budget has been allocated to this project? Who is controlling that budget? What constraints are they under? What support are they given to drive that? Because the thing is, the way that I explain it is, it's great that you say that you care about, diversity or equity, but the fact is you clearly care about 100 other things more. And I need you to be honest about where that care, shows up in terms of your priority list.
So I've just had clarification, a bit more of a nuanced question there. So Deanne was asking how you, Aubrey, specifically show up as you your white passing. So
yeah.
Sorry, I probably read the question.
Oh, no, that's good. Thank you, Deanne, so much for clarifying. For me, specifically, I think of the fact that I'm white passing as a tactical weapon against white supremacy. So I'm Latina. I'm also Indigenous from my father's line. And so for me, because I am spared from sort of like the casual racism that a lot of people from my community are, but also because I can say things that are much spicier and not get the same level of abuse for them as people who are darker members of my community get. Me personally, I use that as a tactical weapon, but for me also, I think I take it as a moral obligation. Sounds like it's forced, as opposed to something I find a blessing that I had the opportunity to do, which is I try to speak truth to power as much as possible to open the door so that one day there's more space for people from my community who don't look like the average tech founder's daughter to do that work. So for me, I actually modulate my identities contextually to try to create the most opening. So sometimes I play down being a racial minority because it helps me have spicier conversations with white people. Sometimes I play it down for my own safety. But also I try to be open about my identity, because while I think my having been successful in my career is partially a product of white supremacy, right? That I've been able to be an executive in tech. My skin color has undoubtedly helped me. So I do talk about being Latina because there are so few people from my community at this level that I need to be loud enough. So hopefully someone who doesn't look like me but identifies as part of my community is the person sitting in my seat next. And hopefully many, many other seats besides.
Thank you so much. We're right on 9 o'clock, so I'm going to let you go there. Thank you, Aubrey, so much. That was absolutely excellent. We have so many questions coming through, so I'm sure that you'll have a few tweets coming your way today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and contributing such amazing questions. They were really thoughtful. So we've got Liminal running every morning this week from 8 a.m. till 9 a.m. So we hope to see you tomorrow morning. Thanks, Aubrey, and everyone for joining us. Bye. Thank you.